Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial here today on YouTube, I'd like to share a project with you. Now, it could be the tail of a mermaid, could be the tail of a dolphin, could be the flukes of a whale's tail. I don't know, I'm not a cetacean biologist. Just don't have that level of skill. Anyway, this is the project I'd like to share with you today. I've added a bead onto this one, and I have a couple of variations with regards to what kind of wire we're going to use. It's a beautifully simple project. There's no great depth of skill required, just a willingness to have a go, get your hands on some lovely, lovely wire to work one of these up for yourself. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you now what we're going to make together and what we need to do that. So if you've been with me for a little while, you may see the basic technique is quite similar to my crescent pendant, which uses this chaos winding technique. Now I've set a 6mm round garnet on this one and a tiny 4mm black agate on this one. The difference between these two pieces is basically this has a 1mm or 18 gauge wire basis, with some 24 gauge or 0.5mm added over the top, whereas this one is worked up in a slightly heavier fashion. There are fewer passes of wire to create a very similar look. So if you are using the lighter set of wires, you will need to have slightly more wire to work up to get a really detailed look. And if you're working with the slightly heavier wires, so the frame here is 16 gauge or 1.25mm wire, but I've used much less of the winding wire over the top, probably about 2/3 the amount as I did on this piece, but it's just a slightly heavier wire. It's 0.6mm or 22 gauge wire. So either of those will work perfectly. I'm going to demonstrate today with some 1mm gauge wire, which is equivalent to 18 gauge, and I have already cut around about 10 inches of that 18 gauge wire to work with. Just pop those out of the way for a second so I don't knock them into infinity. So this is around about 10 inches or so of that 1mm 18 gauge wire, and I do really want to have a nice smooth warmth put into the wire before we get working. As I mentioned earlier, you can work in slightly heavier gauges if you prefer. You could choose to use 1.25 16 gauge wire for this part of the project. I'm going to use a round form now to create the first little crescent shape that we're going to work with. I've got my trusty wooden mandrel. You could use almost any round form you like, and we're putting a small crescent shape down in the very centre of that length of wire. Now what I like to do, and this is completely within your remit to control, I like this to be quite a tight little form, coming back, almost turning in on itself, as you would imagine a crescent moon to look. I'm going to pop my pliers in at the end of that crescent and just start that wire going backwards like so. And then the same on the opposite side. Now you could have that coming further around, you could have it slightly more open, it's absolutely up to you. You can decide whether it's a mermaid tail or a dolphin tail or a whale tail, whatever makes you happy. With a few tweaks to the design, you could even make a koi carp tail if you prefer. So I'm just going to fine up those angles ever so slightly until I'm happy. I think that looks pretty decent to begin with. What I'm going to do now is put a little bit of extra warmth just up at the top here, and then start circling that around. Now I'm allowing the wire to do the work for me rather than trying to use another form. And it will just, if you apply some warmth to it, enable you to make that swooshing form. In a moment I'm going to sharpen up these tail ends. I'm not going to close them completely off, but I do want them to be slightly finer than they are right now. So again, warm that wire first, and once that's warm you can just allow the wire to come around to match the other side. So we're trying to go for a little bit of symmetry here. What I want to do now is just to get slightly tighter angles on the end, so I'm going to grip very firmly here and here to try and keep those wires steady and stable. And I'm just going to give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze to take it slightly tighter. Nothing too tight, just a little tighter than it was. And the same on the other side. What I want to be able to do is still get my pliers inside so I can just get this to look exactly how I want it to. So I've got this almost crescent moon shape. And what I want to do now is add a little bit more of a gap at the top before drawing that inwards to create a very, very simple bail up at the top. So I've just done a little bit of figure of 8 weaving on this one. I won't spend too much time on the bail. It's very, very simplistic today. So let's just pop that down for a second. Trying to get that to be as symmetrical as possible before coming around about 1/3 up from the one side and just putting a bit of an upright bend on it. Now if you're going for a mermaid tail, you might want this to be slightly more asymmetrical. I'm going to flip the design over now and try and replicate that position that the bend occurred on the opposite side. You could use a tape measure or a piece of fabric if you wanted to get that more accurately the same. So you've got some choices here. If you were going for a mermaid, you might want the design to flare out first before coming back in, like so. But if you're going for a tail or a set of flukes on the end of a tail, then you might want to just bring that in slightly. The technique overall is going to be the same, but this is what I am looking to achieve today. I'm bringing those in slightly together, and then I'm just going to draw them over until it crosses at the central point. I want that to be quite centralised before popping in an upright on either side. So there's the first one. Again, I'm going to flip the design over, pop those pliers in again, flip the design up at the top. So you've got this funny little bulbous shape which represents part of the tail. As I said, if you're making this as a mermaid tail, you might want that to just swoosh outwards, and you're going to fill in this gap with the same chaos technique as we're going to use on the crescent part of the design. If you are using 1mm or 18 gauge wire, you might like to hammer your design at this stage, as it will make things ever so slightly easier for you whilst you're doing that chaos infill. I'll show you a little bit about how to do that now, or you could simply use a 1.25mm gauge or 16 gauge wire instead. So I've got a teeny tiny block to work with today and a very light hammer. It's got a relatively flat, albeit slightly chamfered surface, and I'm just going to add a little bit of strength. I'm going to stop short of this top angle up here, and I'm just going to hammer the rest of it so that it's just got a little bit more residual strength. So what you will see is that your shape is being created just a little bit more strongly, so that now you can apply the winding or weaving over the top without fear of giving that a little bit of a reshape as you go through. So I'm going to be working, because I started with that 1mm or 18 gauge wire, I'm going to add some 0.5mm gauge, which is approximately equivalent to 24 gauge wire. And I want to have two lengths of around about 12 inches each. So I'll cut 24 inches from the reel, pop that out of the way, and then cut that in half. So I've got about 12 inches of two sections of that finer gauge, 0.5 or 24 gauge wire. And what I'm going to do is start layering up the chaos infill. So my favourite way to do this is with two wires side by side. I'm going to pinch those very, very firmly to create a loop. And what I want to happen is for those two wires to stay side by side, like the two lanes of a roadway. I don't want them to cross over anywhere other than the point at which I'm purposefully crossing them over, like so. So they're constantly staying side by side. And the first thing I'm going to do is anchor that on one side over the top of my pendant shape. So I'm going to pinch very firmly with my non-dominant hand, take both of those tails all the way around the frame, and circle those two wires side by side around the frame. Now the technique that we're looking to achieve here is to grip the frame that we've made, that flukes, those flukes rather, or that fluke tail. And what we're looking to do is to spiral those two wires side by side around that frame without losing the side-by-sideness all the way around. It will make sense. So I'm just going to tighten that up ever so slightly with my bent chain nose pliers to get that to sit neatly. And I'm going to draw the tail of the wire underneath the frame, again making sure that there's no crossover occurring. I'm going to draw them very tidily in a straight line across the back of the design. Now you have an option at this stage to decide whether or not you're going to make this a two-faced pendant. On this design that I'm holding in my hand now, we're looking at the back of the design, and all of the passes over the back of the design, bar one, are straight lines. Over the front of the design, all of the passes are curly and wiggly, adding to that chaos feel. If I bring in the slightly heavier piece, on this one I chose to do curls on both the back and the front. So this is really quite attractive to wear in either direction, either without a gemstone or with a gemstone. If you're going to put straight lines across the back, it's quite a different look and feel. It looks almost bandaged. So you might like to put curls on both sides. But I'm going to show you how to make a very strong pendant with the slightly less amount of wire. So we're going to bring those two side-by-side wires across the back of the design and then draw the tail of wire outside the underneath of that frame. Just push that around. Now the key here is to keep those two wires side by side. So I'm going to pull that firmly into position and then tighten that up. So you can see we've got a straight pass across the back and a curled pass across the front. So I'm going to rotate this around so that it's upside down and make sure that I get just the tiniest touch of warmth into those two passes of wire that sit over the top of the design. I'm going to bring the tails up and through inside that pendant gap or inside that pendant frame and draw those around. Now the key, as I mentioned, is to keep those two wires side by side. Push the wires around and make them do what you want. Now what I'm going to do on this side of the design, we went for a straight line over here on the right hand side of the tail. On the left hand side, if you wanted to go for that dual faced design, I'm going to show you in one easy move that you can add a curvy section on the back as well. So we're going to flip the design over to look at the rear of the design. You can see we've got that straight line from earlier, and what we're going to do is pinch our thumb and forefinger together over that whole entire piece of jewellery that we're working on, and I'm going to bring those two wires up and around. You can release as you need to move this around, but what I'm doing is I'm ensuring that that little curled section acts like a two-track raceway or a two-track roadway. What you're seeing is those two side-by-side wires, they're not crossing over during that journey. So if I turn this gently back around, bring those tails, the tails of the wire rather, up inside the frame that we've created together. Just pop those up and inside. Again, we're taking care to make sure that they don't cross over. If I bring those tails up and through, let me just trim away the one that's slightly longer than the other. Should make it slightly easier to see. And I'm going to draw that through and tight. And you'll see that we've got a curl on the back as well as on the front. In this way you can wear the pendant in either direction. So what will happen is you're going to run out of wire, and working with more than 12 inches is perfectly feasible, just gets a little bit tricky and annoying. So when you come to the end of your wire, I'll tell you what, let's just do one more pass of wire over the top here. So I'm going to pinch firmly, and the pinching is what's keeping those two wires side by side. So I'm circling the tails of the cut wire around. If I move the pendant, so you can see that we've created a nice squirrely section. Those wires haven't crossed over. And what we're going to do is wrap around the frame just here. Push those tails up and inside the framework. As you get towards the end, it might be helpful to use your pliers just to draw that through. Again, taking care to make sure that those wires don't cross over. Tightening up that bond. And then if we flip this over to whichever you decide the back is, I'm going to try and make this as dual-faced as possible today. So I've got those two passes of wire curling around the frame wire. I'm going to trim away so there's just the tiniest amount of excess past that frame that we created, and hammered. Get those 2 excess pieces out of the way, and then I'm going to use my fine bent chain nose pliers just to take those end sections inside the framework. And get that nice and neat and tidy. You can just rotate that around very, very gently to get a good grip onto the frame. So if I flip this over, you'll see what we've got so far. We've got 3 curls that we can see visibly. One of them's on the back here, 2 of them are on the front. If I bring in a piece that I have used 2 sets of twin 12-inch lengths of wire, so altogether this has taken 48 inches, and it's 2 lots that have been curled and then attached. On this piece I've gone for straight lines on the back and curls over the front. You can see how quickly this is going to build up. So I'm going to add 1 more section of wire over the surface on this design before showing you a very, very simple bail, and also how to add in that bead if you desire to use one. So I'm just going to cut myself a couple more 12-inch lengths of that 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, and we'll see what that looks like as we build up the design together. So I have my 3rd set of 2 wires, and these are approximately 12 inches again, and what I'm going to do is start off by creating a loop freehand, pinching very, very firmly to create that side-by-side wire effect. They come apart slightly there, but they are not crossing, and that's the key. So I'm going to find a place to add this into the design. I'm just going to lay it over the surface for now, and then find access points. You will find the access points are slightly trickier to come by as you build the layers up, but the effect is so lovely that you won't mind just taking a moment to get that to sit. So I'm going to coil all the way around that frame, bring the wire across the back, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side. When I'm setting a new set of wire, I do tend to get this central piece attached firmly before I move on to using up both of those sides of the wire. So I think what you can do as well, I'm going to take the wire all the way up so it's slightly further away. If I just tilt this into the light, you'll see the journey it's going to take. I could leave that in a straight line, but what I might do is take that coil in the opposite direction. So again, I'm pinching and pushing the wires down, hitting the camera en route, so that I've got myself this little double swooshing action. So you should be able to see the journey that the wire has taken all the way around and then around in the opposite direction. Pinch that very, very firmly and bring those tails of wire up inside the framework. So they've separated apart, which is something that does happen. So I'm just going to pinch very firmly with my non-dominant thumb and just try to bring those through at the same times. And you'll see that it does 9 times out of 10 just work out for you. So we've set another layer of wire squirreliness over on the side. I'm just going to go freehand for a couple of moments and just add some more detail. And I tend to just it is a chaos weave. It's not really a weave, it's a chaos manoeuvre. There's no rhyme or reason to how you should have to set this. I'm just going to separate those 2 top bars for a second whilst I get the wires to go where I want them to. Again, taking care that they're not crossing over. And then I'm going to draw this down the back of the design. I could make it curly or I could put it into some straight lines. If it's going to be a very long straight line, I might just add a tiny bit of manoeuvring to it so that it's less dull. And then just find an access point, pop those 2 tail wires up inside the design, pull that firmly through. Again, making sure that the wires don't cross over before flipping back to the front, and then I will find places for these wires to just finish off. So I could probably just whiz through this. I might silence myself and get my technical team to just speed on through this part. So I've just finished off adding those 3rd sections to the design, and you can see that that's 3 lots of 12 inches times 2. So that it's quite wire hungry, which is why it's interesting to try it with a slightly heavier wire, builds up quicker, fewer inches of wire are used. So what I'm going to do is a very, very quick little weave up at the top just to demonstrate what you can add to the design in terms of the world's simplest bail. I'm just going to trim away around about 12 inches of wire so that you get the idea. Ideally, one would work from the reel so you could continue a simple weave along this section for as long as you'd like to. So I'm just going to anchor on to begin with. I'm working again now with the 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, and I'm going to do a very simple 3 and 3 basket weave. So that's a particularly ugly start I've made there. Just going to trim that tail away rather than trying to get it tidied. I've slightly made a mess of that, so just going to tidy that up slightly. 3 wraps of wire around one side, slide that down to the base of the design, make sure that that sits neatly and that there are no bits that are sticking up. We're currently looking at the back of the design, just need to make sure that there are no sticky uppy bits. So I'm going to give that a little squish and a squeeze, flip the design over to its face, and all we're going to do is a very rapid 3 and 3 design. So this is a basket weave starting just before that angle that we created. That's 1, that's 2, that's 3. Swap direction 1 and 2 and 3. If you struggle because it's a slightly heavier wire than you're normally using, we would normally do this kind of a weave with a 0.4 or 26 gauge. What you can do is every time you complete 3 wraps, you can just tidy them up slightly using your pliers. Give them a bit of a squish and a squeeze, and it will just bring that slightly neater element to the design. You should be doing it every time you do 3, but obviously I just want to get an idea of what we're going to do rather than spend too long worrying about something I've shown you several times before. So this is a very, very simple basket weave, 3 on one side, 3 on the other side. You can tidy those up if you like. You'll need to do it before you make the form turn through the circular motion to give us that lovely bail. So that was around about 12 inches of wire that we've used, and as it happens it's going to be probably just about enough for what we need. So I'm just going to continue until I've finished all of that wire up. So that's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 on either side, and then when it starts getting tricky we're just going to cut that away. I think I'll finish this side. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3. Tidy those little weaves up, and then if I flip this over to the back, what I need to do is try and get as close to inside between those 2 tram lines as possible to just trim that wire away. Neaten up those tiny little ends so that they don't stick up and impale you at any time. What we're going to do then is grip hold of the whole thing at the point that we made that angle change and draw that forwards, and then we could use a round form such as a pen, or you can use your bail making pliers if you prefer to make a round form through which you can thread your favourite necklace or whatever you want to hang this design from. So all we're going to do here is splay those 2 wires at the back. This is what I think of as a speedy bail. Works on almost every pendant design you can think of. So we've splayed those out at around about 45 degrees on the back. I might take one slightly higher than the other, and I'm just going to draw one of those tails around the neck at the point that we made that angle change. So I'm going to draw that over for a second time, and then just bring that last little bit around the back of the design. So just very, very carefully draw that over to the back and squash it into position. You could, if you wanted to, take the second side and turn it into a coil, which you can sit over the front or the back of the design. This is a gender neutral design, so you might not want to have coils. They are often seen by jewellery makers as quite feminine. That said, I like them in my designs, and I will make them in designs for gentlemen as well. So you go your own way. I think I'm going to make a very tiny coil and just pop it on the back to show you what you can do with that second wire. Round nose pliers at the very end of that wire, at the very end of the pliers, until you start getting that round form. And then push that round form against your non-dominant forefinger until that coil meets the position you want it to sit at. Now, if you had gone for curls on both the front and the back in this design, then that would be a really nice way of wearing a pendant without a gemstone in this direction and with a gemstone in this direction. So I'm just going to have a bit of a rifle on my desk and see if I can find a gem that works really nicely with this tail or tail flukes. Flukes of a tail? Like I said, I'm not a cetacean biologist. I've no idea what they're actually called. So let's find a gemstone and I'll pop that on the pendant. So I found a pot of very diminutive little pink opals. I've also got a pot of small black agates. Now, I've also got a pot of fluorites. For this design, the best gemstone that I would have in front of me right now is the agate. Fluorite has a tendency to crack if you put a great deal of pressure on it. The pink opal, it's a little bit stronger than the fluorite, but it is very diminutive drill holes. So I'm going to discount both of those, and I'm going to use one of the black agates. It also means I can continue to use that same wire, which is the 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, and I'm going to cut myself around about 5 or so inches, which is more than plenty to just attach the gemstone. So I'm going to find the drill hole, which is always the challenge, and centralise my bead on that short length. This could be a scrap of wire that you have around, and I'm just going to fold the wire either side of those drill holes so you get this kind of C-shaped design. And I'm going to bring those two together as centralised as possible. Now, I don't want to faff too much with the wire at this stage because I don't want to overly weaken it. What we're going to do is find ourselves a position on our pendant and post both of the tails of the wire through the same aperture. So I'm going to draw that all the way through until it sits into a position that makes me happy. So you can push that down because we've chosen a nice strong gemstone. I'm quite happy with where that's sitting, so I'm just going to bring those two tails around and find a place to anchor those tails onto the frame that we created together. Now, they do need to be really firmly pulled into position. We don't want that gemstone moving around once we've finished the design. So I've now got a section of wire, or 2 sections of wire rather, sticking out over the surface, and what we can do is we can add one last coil or swoosh the design if we wanted to. If you don't want to, you can simply trim away and cut the excess off. Let's have a look and see where this will go to. I think that will probably fit quite nicely down here. There's not quite enough wire for me to do a second loop, so I'm just going to find a place for that to go into the design and then draw those tail wires up together. Now, one thing I will say is having tails the same length make it much easier to get in the same gap on your design. So if one is slightly longer than the other, it does pay to trim them until they're about the same length. And then you can just post them up inside the design. Make sure that they're both coming through the same hole. Let's just give that a bit of a tease to get that one through. And you might have to chase the other one if it's gone off by itself. Just make sure it goes through the same position, so that they will sit neatly side by side. I actually can't see that. There it is. There it is. So I'm going to draw those both around neatly together so they sit over the back of the design, where I'm going to trim any excess away. Looks like I've disturbed one of the earlier pieces, but I'm not overly worried about that because everything is nice and neat and tidily put together. And what we're looking for is just to ensure that there's no snaggly bits. There's the bit that I was trying to get rid of. There we go. So push everything down as a final mark. Make sure that you've got no movement. And there, together we have made another tail or tail flukes. Mermaid tail maybe. A couple of cute, really quick and easy and fun to make pendant. I hope you've enjoyed making that as much as I have. I really love making these. The chaos design is fabulous. It's again very, very mindful. You can pick it up and put it down as and when you please. Have yourself a beautiful day. I will put all the links to my socials in my description of the video below. So if you want to follow me elsewhere, please do feel free to join me on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, as well as subscribing here on YouTube. Have a beautiful day. Bye for now.